The mini album is a photographic series that reproduced every single page of an album that I had when I was 16 years old. And this is a typical plastic album that every adolescent of my age in the 80s actually used to have and used to put in different pictures, family pictures. And in that particular album, I had put all the images of explosions or bombardments that happened around our house in 1982 as we were going through the first weeks of the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon. So I am interested in those two overlapping, the life of a child or an adult child becoming adult, going through a historical major event such as the Israeli invasion. And so it's like the headlines, the news overlapped with intimacy of personal life, simply. My work was marked significantly by the Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Could be because I was 16 years old, maybe. But this is a summer when Israel invaded Lebanon, reached Beirut, occupied Beirut, directed elections of a president. A president was assassinated, and all of this is in 2 months. Really, a very intense period happened when I was 16 years old, learning photography and trying to enjoy summer as much as possible because all of this happened in a period of summer. It is this summer where I took pictures of cactuses at home, pictures of my sister playing piano, but also pictures of airplane bombing entourage of our house before we went to shelters. So I am interested in those two overlapping. I don't think we can talk about the war without talking about emotions, intimacy, life at home that tries to continue and is never interrupted. So I made several objects, artworks related to this overlap. In the beginning, it was this day, the film that I made in 2003. I finished in 2003, but I started in 2000, about different photographic collections in relationship to their makers. So those were photographic collections of people deciding to shoot their contexts, to document their contexts. And there is this threshold of consciousness where all of a sudden one realizes that what one is going through is actually worth being part of history, is a universal story, or if it is, even if it's a very specific and very subjective story, it has the possibility of becoming a universal story as well. And I think within my work, recording, the idea of recording is related to boredom. You come back from school at 4, TV used to start at 6, you have homeworks, you need to develop something else to do at home, all sorts of activity. You could play piano, you could use your mechanical games, Lego, etc. But also you would record audio, music, people talking, your mother singing, take pictures. And this was the time when I used to use my father's camera to learn photography. This is how I started recording audio tapes that included songs but also news. I remember very, very well, for example, one time I recorded the announcer of the news on Radio Monte Carlo describing what he saw in Sabra and Shatila, for example, in September 1982. And he was crying in the middle of the... it was really an intense period of time, but after this you would hear the ABBA singing, for example, because life continues. And this is exactly what the project is about. This is exactly what all the different elements of summer of 1982 mean to convey. I used to make also jackets for my audio tapes, so I used to cut nice pictures from magazines and make them like covers of those audio tapes. So recording is recording in audio, in photography, but also taking notes of and making summaries of what happened every day. It can be like a glass broke at school. It could be like I failed a physics exam. It could be like I watched Hitchcock's I Confess, Vertigo, or things like that. What to do with all of this? I've used this material while making this day, but after that I started exhibiting parts of those documents. So I needed to record them, I needed to reproduce them, but sometimes I also showed the albums and the tapes physically in the exhibition. Doing so, there are always so many constraints. So you cannot hear the music that is on the tape. You see it as an object, but you cannot hear the music. You cannot open the album on the page that you want. You cannot flip through it. There are still kind of valuable objects that need to be placed under vitrine and with limited access. Physically, the objects brought an additional value to the information that is on them. So the music, as much as the music and the audio component is important, looking at the tape brought something additional to the understanding of the object as an object and to understand the situation, because after all, we are interested in writing history more than simply showing images. This is why I decided to reproduce every single page of that album, because I thought the sequence becomes a meaningful sequence. And here it became a 19 picture sequence. Now it's very clear for the album because you see the images in the sequence. This is exactly what happened for the audio tapes. The audio tapes were used entirely while making this day. When I made this day, I made sure that photographic records have the same importance as audio records, because all the audio that you hear in the film is not brought from archives. It's my audio tapes. And then after making the film, I said, okay, but those soundtracks, those recordings, are not only data. They are not only the ABBA singing or the news. They have another layer of information that is worth also being recorded. And that happened only after working 12 years on photographic archives with the Arab Image Foundation. So I started developing sensibility or sensitivity. I was getting interested not only in the pictures themselves, but in the envelope that had the pictures and in the boxes in which the envelopes used to be put. And I was getting interested equally with the frame that contained an image and not only the image itself. So I was really going away from photography, away from documents, and getting more and more interested in the tissue that held those documents. And for me, the jackets of the audio tapes became all of a sudden as important as what's recorded on the tape. It's true that you record because you want to convey an audio or like preserve an audio recording, but you are not aware that actually the envelope and the cassette and the image that you decide to put on the cassette and the inscription that you make on the audio tape after a while become also indicative of other things, of another practice that has nothing to do with the music or the news on it, but has to do with organization of information, that has to do with like who is the person, who is the human being who is writing those. Because we are human beings. We are not like neutral historians, or we're not robots that are just capturing information and storing it. The albums were a reorganization of the pictures I took starting June 6, 1982, chronologically. So the first 6 or 7 pictures are one air raid that happened in the afternoon on June 6, 1982. The first bomb was behind a building, and it was like a tank bomb. It was not coming from an air raid. But after this, when you flip in the album, you see a first raid, a strong explosion. After it, a stronger explosion, and after it, another explosion in the same place. And I tried first to reconstruct that air raid in time. So while I was making this day, I wanted to reconstruct an air raid within a minute and a half, where you see that hill and you see a bomb here, happening here, another bomb happening there, and then a third bomb happening there, reconstituted with a soundtrack as if it's happening in front of you. But all that sequence was made with still pictures that were animated in the editing, in post-production. In order to do that animation, I needed to first create the still canvas with all the 5 or 6 explosions in the same image on different layers. So this is why when you look at the composite image of Saida June 6, 1982, it doesn't have defined edges. The edges make like this because the edges were actually shaped by the different images that were placed one next to another to reconstitute the whole scene. And all of that was supposed to be a middle step towards something else, towards making the animated scene in the film. It wasn't supposed to be a photographic work. So I made the film this day. I made also an excerpt from the film in video, Saida June 6, 1982, without thinking of showing the composite image as a work, as a photographic work in itself. When Walid Raad saw it, it's like, my God, this is such a beautiful piece. I would like to have this, so I think you should show it. So this is where I showed it, and I call it the blueprint. Blueprint in the sense that it's a sketch for the video. Not because it was blue, it was like just the term blueprint. And then later I decided to, it's only later, like few years, maybe 5, 6 years later, that I decided that I need to do the mini album, and therefore documenting page by page the sequence in the album. It's actually like going backwards. One would imagine that you would first photograph the albums and then scan the images and constitute a photographic piece and then do a film. It's actually the opposite that happened.